should be online. Probably takes a few seconds. And there we go, we are live. I wish I could up the video quality. Yeah, I'll figure out how to up my video quality another time. Alright. Finally got my new PS2 controllers in. They're wireless, so I won't have to be constantly doing other stuff. Because it is a capture card, I can have my mouse ready to use whenever I need it.
Incorrect. Which is a better opening move for white? 1 G4 or 1 E4? Correct. This is one of the best ways to begin a chess game. The king pawn occupies a center square, E4, and attacks another, D5. By moving the E pawn, white also clears the lines to develop two pieces, the queen and the king bishop at F1. If you start the game this way, you're playing a king pawn game.
Yeah, pretty much.
Which is a better first move for white? 1 D4 or 1 A4?
I'd imagine D4 since it's taking control of the center space.
Correct. White's D pawn occupies a central square, D4, and lays claim to another, E5. The move D2, D4 also enables the queen bishop at C1 to come into the game, while providing some breathing room for the queen on the D file. If you begin this way, you're playing a queen pawn game.
Yeah.
Which is a better first move for white? 1 C3 or 1 C4?
Depends on what kind of opening you're going for, but I would imagine C3 would be the better option.
Incorrect. This move does attack a central point, D4, but it unnecessarily blocks C3, taking away the ideal developing square for the queen knight at B1. And though it opens the A4 D1 diagonal for white's queen, as does the move C2 C4, the advance C2 C3 doesn't make it possible for any of the minor pieces, bishops or knights, to come out. But it's not a terrible move, and it's still possible to make it germane by the ensuing play.
I mean, to be fair, you didn't specify that you were moving a pawn. You just said a location.
Which is a better first move for white? 1 D. Which is a better first move for white? 1 C3 or 1 C4?
Well, for just moving pawns, C4, yeah.
Correct. Although this move doesn't promote the development of white's bishops or knights, it does begin the assault on a key central base, D5, while not reducing white's options by blocking the queen knight's most effective developing square, C3. Beginning this way has a name. It's called the English opening. It's important to realize, however, that just because the game begins in a particular opening with its own name doesn't mean that it couldn't be changed as play proceeds into a completely different opening with a different name. This is chess, and that's names. Which is a better first move for white? 1 knight f3 or 1 knight c3?
It kind of feels like it depends. It depends upon what kind of opening you're doing and if you're trying to back up another piece.
Correct. This move assails a critical central square, e5, while getting the king-knight to its optimal opening perch, f3. It also clears one of the squares, g1, between the king and the king-rook at h1, so that white can castle kingside sooner.
I didn't really know that kingside knight as a higher is considered more of a correct move than queenside knight in opening. That's new to me.
Incorrect. This is not a bad developing move. Although it expedites castling queenside over kingside, queenside castling tends to take longer while entailing a different set of problems. It does get the queen knight to a fine opening post, c3. It also hits at the central spot, d5. The move 1 knight b1 c3, however, is a little more committal than its kingside counterpart, 1 knight g1 f3. This is because it unnecessarily blocks the c-pawn before determining whether white needs to play an early c2, c4. More of white's opening formations rely on advancing the c-pawn, while fewer require advancing the f-pawn, which entails greater risk to the king.
That's interesting.
Which is a better first move for white? 1 knight c3 or 1 knight h3?
Well, you never want to move a knight onto a rook's path. That is to say, you never want to put it on the edge of the board because you're cutting the knight's movement potential in half. That's how I understood it. So c3.
Correct. From c3, white's knight aggresses the center while observing 8 different squares, the most it can ever do. Furthermore, the development doesn't incur any particular weaknesses. Most weaknesses are mainly spawned by prematurely and illogically advancing pawns, and not so much by moving pieces. This is because pawn moves tend to be more indelible. At the cost of a move or two, you can often, though not always, recover from an unwise piece maneuver by bringing the piece back to where it was. But with pawns, it's not just a matter of wasting time. Pawn moves are permanent. Pawns can never go back to where they were. Once a pawn move is made, the die is cast, and you must accept the consequences.
Is here other one.
Incorrect. This gets out a knight, but to the edge of the board, where its mobility is reduced. At h3, the king-knight attacks a mere 4 squares, which is half the power of a knight positioned at f3, or c3, or c6, or f6. Another problem is that at h3, the king-knight is potentially in line to be menaced and captured by the c8 bishop. This could lead to the disruption of white's kingside pawn cover after the foreseeable capture bishop c8 takes h3 and the anticipated recapture g2 takes h3. If white then castled kingside, or if he were already castled kingside, his king might be endangered and the resulting doubled h pawns could become targets. Which is a better opening move for white? 1b3 or 1h4?
I feel like keeping stuff centralized would be better than trying to bring the rook out early. Although I can't say that I haven't tried bringing a rook out early in the game before. But generally, I would imagine b3 would be the better move.
Correct. This doesn't directly attack the center, but it prepares to post the c1 bishop at b2, where it would snipe at the squares d4 and e5 from the flank. This kind of development is called a fianchetto and is particularly popular in the modern chess world. It's much less popular in other disciplines, such as football.
Alright, fine, you got me with that. Let me hear the other one.
Incorrect. This is a very weakening pawn move that contributes virtually nothing to development while greatly debilitating the king side. The h-pawn is likely to become a permanent liability, deterring white from castling kingside. If white were to castle kingside, the h-pawn would lose its original protector, the h1 rook.
I mean, yeah. I figured that was the case.
Which is a better opening move for white? 1b4 or 1a3?
b4 kind of screws the bishop. You can't really just go straight out. And a3, while it does advance a pawn and keeps it in protection of both the knight, rook, and other pawn, I don't think it's really contributing enough. It just kind of creates a pocket for a bishop or something like that to try and sneak in right there to try and rook. Although, I suppose b4 kind of does the same thing, although to a much greater degree. But it takes away movement options from the knight, and I would imagine that the knight is much more important in this particular case in an opening.
Correct. This advance fails to tackle the center directly, but it prepares for the queen bishop's deployment to b2. From there, the bishop dominates the center's dark squares along the diagonal. The move's primary drawback is the b-pawn itself. On b4, the pawn tends to be a mark for black sharpshooters. Incorrect. This move doesn't attack the center, nor does it facilitate development. About all it does is guard b4, which may not be especially relevant in a game that hasn't as yet been delineated. But inferior moves such as 1a3 shouldn't be taken lightly either. If black plays mechanically, thinking any old set of developing moves will do, it's possible that white might be able to steer the game into channels where a2, a3 has subsequent utility. This is why, if you really want to play chess well, You must work hard from move 1. Too often we play the first few moves by rote, and then start thinking on move 4 or 5, when it already might be too late. Which is a better opening move for white? 1g3 or 1g4?
I would say 1g3, because 1g4 blocks the bishop.
Correct. White's simple pawn to flank the king bishop at g2, where it stands sentinel over e4 and d5. Once the king bishop is then developed, white will be a step closer to castling kingside. Incorrect. This advance prepares the king bishop's posting at e, but it injures the g-pawn by placing it where it can easily be threatened. Moreover, several kingside squares are severely weakened, particularly f3, f4, h3, and h4. Once g2, g4 is played, none of these squares can ever again be guarded by the g-pawn, making them vulnerable to enemy piece invasion. White's kingside will be like Swiss cheese, full of holes. Which is a better first move for white? 1 f3 or 1 f4?
F3 blocks knight development, and early game knights tend to be the more important ones to worry about. I'd say f4.
Correct. While not a developing move, f2, f4 doesn't hinder development either. It also brandishes its guns at e5, a focal middle point. In some situations, it can combine with white's queen bishop when flanked on b2 and white's king knight when activated to f3, control the central dark squares d4 and e5. This is the kind of teamwork that wins chess games. Incorrect. This is a very poor move. It adds nothing to development and even deprives the king knight of its best square, f3. It flails at the center square, e4, but it exposes the king to potential danger along the deadly e1, h4 diagonal. Along this pregnable line, e1, h4 for white, e8, h5 for black, many a short game has ended in a fool's mate. An unblockable queen check at h4 for black, and comparably, after black has opened f7, f6, an unblockable queen check at h5 for white. When I was younger, my compatriots at the Marshall Chess Club in New York used to call this beginning the King Charles attack, 1 f3 and 2 king f2. And you remember what happened to him. Which opening move is better for white? 1 knight a3 or 1 h3?
Well, if you're thinking about castling, h3 kind of gimps castling to a certain extent. Not greatly, mind you, it's still protected by a pawn. And it would be protected by the knight. But knight 3, knight to b3, while not necessarily a great move, still covers c4 and b5. And b5 you can use to go for a trade, more or less.
Correct. This is a tough call because neither move, knight b1 a3 or h2 h3, is meritorious. With one knight b1 a3, white activates a knight, but away from the center. One possibility is that later on the knight can be repositioned toward the center, let's say to c4. But the game might not develop along lines that render this transfer feasible or desirable. At least knight b1 a3 doesn't incur a pawn weakness, and this is something.
Pawn weaknesses stick around for the rest of the game.
This is a nebbishy start. It registers nothing in the center, and it snubs development. It also engenders a grave kingside weakness at g3. After moving the king-rook pawn, white may have difficulty securing this vulnerable square. And then there's the h-pawn itself, which becomes a point of attack if white castles kingside. The fact is, beginning a game by moving either rook pawn is asking for trouble.
That's about what I thought.
Which is a better reply for black to white's opener 1h3? 1a6 or 1e5?
Well, e5 is the better move in general. So that.
Correct. This is the best retort. Black occupies a key central square, e5, and snarls at another, d4. Additionally, black can now develop both the queen and king bishop. In responding this way, black steals the initiative from white, who futilely wasted his first move by moving the king-rook pawn.
Let's see what happens with the other.
Incorrect. The advance a7, a6 pays no attention to the center, and it doesn't build development. It guards b5, but this might be meaningless in the course of the ensuing game. Such a rook-pawn beginning doesn't fight fire with fire. Rather, it ensures that black gets burned too.
That's an interesting way to say it.
A better reply to white's 1f3, 1e5, or 1e6.
Well, if we were going for the standard king's opening, I would probably do e6.
Incorrect. This is not a bad move. It speeds up development and deals with the center, but it's not as aggressive as moving the e-pawn 2 squares forward. It also blocks black's own forces a little bit, especially the c8 bishop along the clogged c8 h3 diagonal. Generally, the further ahead you advance your center pawns, the more space you have behind the lines to maneuver and deploy.
There we go.
Squares if the opportunity arises. It aggresses the center and prepares the activation of two pieces, queen and with f3 obstructed by a pawn, white loses one of the best ways to assail black's e5 pawn, a knight development to f3. Which is a better black response to 1g4? 1d5 or 1 knight f6?
D5 isn't a bad option.
Incorrect. Here is a case where good intentions backfire. Black develops a piece with a threat to g4, but the fox becomes the hound, and the hound the fox, after white replies by moving the pawn to g5 with a pincer counter to black's knight. Not every developing move is propitious. Let's make this clearer. Is a development good if it allows you to be mated in one move? Of course, this is overstating our case here, for knight g8 f6 doesn't lead to black getting checkmated. But both players have to consider the consequences of each turn, especially in the first few moves of a game, when the fight is for ultimate control and a faulty step can lose valuable time and therefore the initiative.
Fair enough, I probably should have thought about that a tad bit more.
Correct. This strikes at a central square, e4, and establishes a beachhead on another, d5. Moreover, the diagonal line of black's queen bishop is now cleared, and to a starving bishop, white's g4 pawn looks morsel.
That was a fun way to do it.
Which is a better response for black to 1b4, 1b5, or 1a5?
Neither are good. A5 is better though, as it just completely blocks the pawn from any further advancement, as well as not putting a pawn in, well, en passant. Well, actually, I think you would have to move forward one more space for en passant, but yeah. I think A5, or sorry, B5. I had to double check there. B5 would be a better option.
Incorrect. This may seem to put black in the same boat as white, but it's black's side that will probably sink first. Symmetrical play, where black copies white, is very dangerous, for there are no last licks in chess. If you're checkmated, you don't then get the opportunity to tie the score by checkmating your opponent. What's a better try for black? Moving either center pawn 2 squares or developing the king-knight. All of these draw on sound principles and make sense.
I mean, I thought ideally made sense blocking their pawn from further development while not putting my own pawn directly in a line of fire. Alright. Convince me.
Correct. While not particularly a commendable thrust, a7, a5 threatens to take the b pawn and prepares to open the a file, clearing the file for the a8 rook. You can open a file by exchanging pawns, and usually in order to exchange a pawn, you must first advance it. Still, a7, a5 here is superior to the static b7, b5, which merely apes white without particular benefit. If you must be active or passive, be active and make things happen. When you lose, at least you can say you did it your way.
I mean, yes and no. The whole point with white is they're supposed to be the aggressor, with black playing the defense. But so it just kind of depends.
Which is a better reply for black to 1 knight c3, 1 knight c6, or 1 d5?
One is actively moving a piece. One is actively moving a piece into threat with the knight. However, it's protected with the queen, so the other move doesn't really do a whole lot. Moving it opens up the queen, but it blocks the knight. that's knight to c6. Well, knight to c6 doesn't really do much either. It blocks a pawn. It opens up the knight a lot. However, I feel like queen opens up a lot more options.
Correct. Black's direct assault on the center, d7, d5, usurps space and opens paths for the queen and queen bishop. It also arms black with the option of advancing further, d5, d4, against white's c3 knight. This would probably lead to a loss of time, as white's beleaguered knight scurries to safety. It also makes a statement. By being bold and direct and different, black announces his unwillingness to draw. He wants more.
A problem with that, though, if everyone makes the same statement, it's no longer different. It's no longer bold. It's expected.
Incorrect. This copycat play is okay, but it doesn't allow black to stamp the position with distinctive character. If you want to outplay your opponent, don't rely on emulating his moves, which in effect says you're content to draw the game. Do something different, then try to make your ideas work better than your opponent's.
Well, sometimes copying can be fun. Especially in cases where you want to throw them off at some point. It just depends on your development.
Which is a better answer to 1e4? 1e5 or 1g5?
G5 doesn't feel like it's accomplishing a lot. I can still move out. Bishop can come out, but the bishop doesn't really have a lot to do. The bishop doesn't really have a lot to do with either pawn, really. It doesn't block the knight in either case, but one prevents the pawn from advancing. It's real. And I know that from earlier that well, I guess in white's case it would be g4 isn't exactly a very good move, as it breaks apart the king's. So e5.
Correct. Although this is a symmetrical response, it's still a very good move that attacks the center, gains space, opens lines for development, and establishes a physical presence at the frontier. Incorrect. True, it prepares to fianchetto the king-bishop at g7, but that's just about its only value point. It weakens black's king side, especially f5, f6, h5, and h6, for black's g-pawn can no longer guard these squares for the remainder of the game. This makes them inviting to marauders, lying in wait for black to castle kingside. Furthermore, the g-pawn itself actually becomes vulnerable to white's bellicose attack force. Which is a better counter to 1e4? 1 knight a6 or 1 c5?
c5 is it's not great, but it does develop the pawn and still allows for the development of the knight. It does open up space for the queen to come out, but it does nothing for the bishop. However, knight to 6, it does create something interesting. If you wanted to try and go for the pinch or fork, but otherwise it's not a very good option. I'd say c5 sounds better.
Correct. This is called the Sicilian defense, 1e4 c5, and has become a staple of the contemporary tournament player. Although its only immediate contribution to development is to clear the a5 d8 diagonal for black's queen, it strikes at the heart of the center, d4, with asymmetrical fervor. It also prepares to exchange the c-pawn for white's d-pawn once white advances the d-pawn to d4. This would result in black having more pawns remaining on the central files than white. Black would retain the d and e pawns, white only the e pawn. Generally, if you have more pawns in a region, you have an excellent chance to wrest control of the region. And what better place to have dominance than in the center? Incorrect. It doesn't attack the center. It places the knight on a vulnerable square, and it confines the steed to a rather small corral of only 4 squares. From a6, the knight attacks just b4, c5, c7, and b8. And not that he would want to, but after one knight b8, a6, white always has the option of exchanging light square bishop for a6 knight. Bishop f1 takes a6, impairing black's pawn structure at whim. Finally, chess is supposed to be a logical game. You play a move, your opponent replies, and you answer your opponent's response. Thrust and parry. The Jejune development 1 knight b8 a6, however, is simply not pertinent to white's opener 1 e4. It doesn't relate. And in chess, that's the worst crime of all. For black, which is a better retort to 1 e4? 1 e6 or 1 h6?
E6, imagine.
Correct. It strikes at the center, d5. It clears 2 splendid diagonals, d8 h4 for the queen, and a3 f8 for the dark square bishop. And it supports the advance d7 d5. Its name is the French defense, and its chief liability is the blocking in of the c8 bishop, which French defense enthusiasts typically refer to as the problem bishop. Which is a better way for black to answer white's 1 e4, 1 c6, or 1 f6?
f6 has the potential to weaken the king side, so I would imagine c6. That way you're not weakening the queen.
Correct. This is called the Caro-Kann defense, 1 e4 c6. And like the Sicilian defense, 1 e4 c5 clears the a5 d8 diagonal for black's queen. But it differs from the Sicilian in that instead of striking at d4, it supports the counterattack d7 d5, which opposes white's. The expansive Sicilian tends to be played by those who enjoy sharp fights, while the compact Caro-Kann appeals more to those striving for solidarity and position play. Which is a better response to... Which is a better way for black to answer white's... Incorrect. This is just a bad move. It doesn't build black's game, in fact it retards it by blocking f6, and it endangers black's king by injuring two diagonals, a2 g8 and e8 h5. The square g6 is also weakened, which can't help black very much either. If there's any one move that smacks of inexpertness, this is it.
Well, good thing I didn't bypass it, or else we would have missed out on that.
Which is a better response to white's 1e4? 1d5 or 1f5? Correct. This is the center counter defense, 1e4 d5, where black wastes no time at getting to the middle. It clears developing routes for the c8 bishop and the queen, and it menaces white's e-pawn. Its chief drawback is that it usually implies the early development of black's queen, which could lead to chessic harassment against Her Majesty. But it does signify a fight, and not all the tactics go white's way. Incorrect. This gambit, an opening sacrifice, usually of a pawn for attack and initiative, is too aggressive and quite hazardous. After white's e-pawn takes pawn takes pawn, pawn 2 e4 takes f5, white envisions a serious queen check at h5, when white's pawn at f5 presents a safe block at g6 because of f5 takes g6. Nor can we say that black gains developmental possibilities because of this premature thrust. It just doesn't work. Which is a better way to reply to 1d4? 1 knight f6 or 1 knight h6?
f6?
Correct. This is an excellent developing move, activating the king-knight toward the center. Meanwhile, it deals with white's primary opening plan, which is to establish a classical pawn center. Two center pawns on the E and D files aligned on their own fourth rank. With knight g8 f6, white is unable to advance his e-pawn 2 squares, for black now controls e4.
I mean, yeah. Makes sense.
Which is a better response to white's 1d4? 1d5 or 1b6?
D5.
Correct. This is a fine retort, producing what's known as a double queen pawn opening. That's where both sides start the game by moving out their d-pawns 2 squares, so that each obstructs its enemy counterpart. Black's reply also meets head-on white's plan to advance the king pawn to e4. Now if white were to play 2e4, black would take white's pawn for free. 2d takes e4. Incorrect. This is not a terrible move per se. It doesn't ignore the center or development, for black aims to post the queen bishop at b7, where it assails the center from the flank. But it's slower than d7 d5, and it doesn't stop white from setting up an ideal 2-pawn center with 2 e2 e4. After 1 d4, which is a better reply by black? 1 f5 or 1 f6?
I mean, since it is on the king's side, neither are necessarily great, but f5 keeps the pawn far enough away that you can move the knight in without much issue.
Correct. This signifies the Dutch defense. 1 d4 f5. Black moves out his f-pawn to control e4 and to dissuade white from advancing his king pawn 2 squares ahead. Its chief frailty is the slight weakening to the e8 h5 diagonal, although black is quite able to cope with whatever white can throw at him. But he should be vigilant, even at so early a stage. Incorrect. This has essentially the same weaknesses as f7, f5, with none of its attributes. Most notably, it is less aggressive, and black does not deter white from pushing the e-pawn to e4. White thus obtains a menacing pawn center and a powerful initiative, and it doesn't cost him anything. Which is a superior response to 1 d4? 1 g6 or 1 g5?
Neither are great. G5, that blocks. Okay, well, G5 just leaves that pawn completely unprotected. So G6.
Correct. The wing push prepares to fianchetto the king bishop at g7, where it would strike at the dark squares in the center. This manner of developing the king bishop illustrates a contemporary approach to central play, in which opposing strategies come to immediate loggerheads. Black permits white to achieve his ends without an upfront fight, but then proceeds to snipe at white with guerrilla tactics. In other words, black allows white to assume a two-pawn center at once with 2 e4, and each player accordingly makes a statement. White in effect says that his center is strong, and that it confers an overall advantage. This opposes black's philosophy, which essentially proclaims that white's pawn center is vulnerable. This is why black surrenders the middle without an initial fight. He believes that as white tries to keep his pressured center intact, black can force his opponent into concessions, such as awkward protections or weakening advances. By getting his heart's desire, the pawn center, so easily, white thereby acquires something to worry about: losing the center. Which strategy is correct? Seizing the center or abandoning it with purpose? Neither and both. The reality is, whoever executes his plan with more skill and accuracy and with more courage and vision will probably triumph.
Only probably.
Incorrect. Move enables black to flank his king bishop, as does g7, g6. But unlike g7, g6, it incurs serious weaknesses, particularly to f5 and h5. These squares will be deprived of the g-pawn's protection for the balance of the game. White's pieces could have a field day invading on and around these susceptible points. Other nearby squares tend to be softened and affected by these adjacent weaknesses. But worse than all this is the fact that 1 g7, g5 hangs a pawn to the c1 bishop. Black drops it. 2 bishop c1 takes g5 with no compensation. Which is a better response to 1 d4? 1 c5 or 1 e5? Correct. On the surface, this looks like a pawn sacrifice, for white can simply take the c-pawn. 2d4 takes c5. Black, however, has a riposte to get the pawn back. 2 queen a5 check. After white blocks the check, black's queen can recapture the c-pawn. Yet it's a trade-off. Black obtains more pawns in the center, one on the d-file and one on the e-file, while white keeps only his e-pawn. But in landing this advantage, black has wasted time, for he's moved his queen twice, and that's not usually a productive way to develop in the opening. Incorrect. This is a pawn sacrifice with little juice, and black has no reliable way to attempt to get the pawn back. After 2d4 takes e5, white's extra pawn actually inhibits black's central maneuvering. When one offers a pawn, it's usually to gain attack and time. But black's offering here doesn't tangibly help his development, and white still keeps the initiative. What kind of gambit is this? Which is a better answer to 1 knight f3? 1 knight c6 or 1 knight f6?
C6 says you're not weakening the king's side. Or to be f6 in order to develop the king's side. It would also be marrying.
Incorrect. Actually, this is a very good move. It attacks the center and develops toward it. It doesn't engender any weaknesses, and it takes steps to prepare queenside castling. If it has any drawback whatsoever, it's that it blocks the c-pawn before it can be determined if an early movement of the c-pawn is desirable. Why reduce your options by playing unnecessarily committal moves? Rather, it makes sense to play flexibly, giving away as little information as possible, and keeping a full range of choices for as long as you can. Correct. I prefer this move. It develops a knight toward the central hub, and it prepares kingside castling, which is more usual than queenside castling because it tends to be quicker. In addition, it's not as committing as 1 knight b8 c6, for it obstructs the f-pawn, not the c-pawn, and it's far less necessary to retain the option of moving the f-pawn early in the game. There's always an element of precariousness in moving the f7 pawn or the f2 pawn for white, for in so doing, black exposes the king to possible danger along the e8 h5 diagonal. Moving the c-pawn, however, merely uncovers the queen along the a5 d8 diagonal. The queen can fend for itself by guarding the line it already occupies, but the king is totally vulnerable to dis threats.
Just because you prefer the move doesn't make it correct.
Which is a better answer to 1 g3? 1 d5 or 1 b5?
D5. You basically drilled it into us at this point. That B5 and G5 are terrible moves.
Correct. This establishes a foothold in the center, seizing the square e4. It also clears developmental paths for the queen and queen bishop, while carrying no real weaknesses. Incorrect. 7 d5, b7 b5 attacks the square c4, but this is not particularly germane or helpful here. And while the advance b7, b5 prepares an excursion of the c8 bishop to b7 from where it looks in on the center, the move is quite weakening, primarily to a5 and c5, as well as a6 and c6. Furthermore, on b5, the b pawn just sits out there, prone to white's queenside ambitions. Which is a better answer to 1c4, or 1e5, or 1d5?
That to me sounds like a bit more of a personal preference. Personally, I would like e5, but d5, technically speaking, does more. It opens up the queenside bishop and it also opens up the queen.
Incorrect. This is often a good move, but here it falters, for it allows white to take black's d pawn with the c pawn. Once black takes back on d5, white winds up with a pawn majority on the central files of 2-1. This should give white greater opportunities in the center, for it tends to be easier to establish control when you possess more soldiers. Then there's the matter of how black takes back. If he does so at once, queen d8 takes d5, his queen is suddenly susceptible to assault. The development 3 knight b1 c3 then serves nicely, and black must waste time transferring his queen to safety. And if he doesn't do it immediately, instead delaying the recapture for a move with 2 knight g8 f6, white can try guarding the extra queen pawn by 3 e2 e4. It appears that the pawn is then hanging for free, but if black's knight takes on e4, 3 knight f6 takes e4, white's queen check at a4 picks up the e4 knight. Correct. The thrust of black's king pawn to e5 is good standard fare. It concerns the center. And is consistent with the plan of early kingside castling. Which is a better response to 1f4? 1e5 or 1g5?
G5 isn't exactly a great move to begin with. G5 is useful? Guess we'll find out next time.
Correct. This is a fine retort, though it's obviously a gambit, for white can take black's pawn for free. 2f4 takes e5. But it's not so simple, for after black follows with the advance of the d pawn, 2d7 d6, it's likely an exchange will take place. 3 e takes d6, bishop takes d6, that fuels black's attack. White must be careful in that his first move, while potentially exposing the king to aggression along the e1 h4 diagonal. That's why after black reacts with 1 e7 e5, many players prefer transposing to a king's gambit by declining the sacrifice. This white does by continuing to e2 e4, which tries to sap black's offer with a counter gambit. The f4 pawn is the bait. Incorrect. This is a gambit all right, but not an efficacious one. For after 2f4 takes g5, black's position looks as bad as it actually is. There are weak squares, f5, h5, and h6, and vulnerable diagonals, 8h5 and d3h7. And there's no place to develop the king-knight. Knight, knight, knight are guarded. Junk this gambit, don't pass go, and start again. Which is a better response to 1b3? 1g6, 1e5. Correct. This is preferable to 1g6 here, even though on e5 the king pawn becomes a target for white's dark square bishop. But black has resources, and he can hold his e-pawn and the early space edge it confers, though white still has the initiative by virtue of starting with the first move. Incorrect. This is actually a perfectly acceptable move. I question it merely because it could lead to slight discomfort after white flanks the queen bishop to bishop c1 b2, menacing the rook at 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 the by places the knight in a vexatious pin. It can't move without exposing the h8 rook. Black can deal with this, though it might result in the disruption of his kingside pawn structure or the premature trade of his own king bishop after, for example, 3 knight b1 c3 bishop f8 g7, 4 knight c3 d5. But it's entirely playable, so try it if you will, but be prepared to cope with the consequences. Start by trying to understand what they are.
Well, it looks like the game crashed. Yeah, there's no sound or anything coming from it. Well, that's one way for the computer to win. Oh, darn. Oh well. Guess I'll have to swap to something else. Alright, well, guess I'll be hopping off for now.